Thank you. Bill Koenig with Koenig World Watch Daily. This is for the panel. In 2004, I did a study that there were 100,000 American church attendees that go to replacement theology churches. Is it possible, or how do you reach those folks, and is it possible with their lack of biblical prophetic understanding?
Let me kick that off. Bill, thank you for coming. I don't know if there's ever been, I don't know if the study that was done, I'd love to see that, if that was a formal study. And my guess is that there's more than that. And so I think that that is a significant issue. Now, I remember speaking at a church that was committed to supersessionism replacement theology, great evangelical church, but didn't see the Bible quite the same way. And I preached at this church, and I did something sort of innocuous like the Messiah in the Passover, sharing about the roots of the faith, and that's not controversial theologically. Then the elderly people, about 150 of them, came to me quietly and said, "We're studying the book of Revelation. Would you come into our Sunday school class and talk to us?" And I went in there, and you had 150 people in a supersessionist church, all committed to a future for Israel. And so I think sometimes there is a deep disconnect between what's in the pulpit and what the average believer feels and understands about the Bible. And I think that came out in our survey, because we don't know where they're getting some of this information, why they believe that God has an eternal binding covenant that he gave to Abram that continues today and into the future. And so I think that the opportunity is ripe for education, as long as it's done with humility and with love, because we are brothers and sisters in the Messiah. And so if we have a belligerent attitude, or we have, we need to come in low and teach up, so that we're able to help our brothers and sisters get another view on Scripture about God's continued role for the Jewish people in Israel in his plan. That's my answer.
Josh Shepard with The Stream. Observing evangelicals' affinity for Israel and for Jewish holy days, many religion reporters see a hidden agenda to proselytize Jews. In your view, what is the nature of the relationship between evangelicals and Jews?
Who would like to take it?
You.
Me? Oh. Well, I'm Jewish, and I believe in Jesus. And I believe that Jesus gave us a commandment to make disciples of all nations. So all of us, we're evangelicals. It's built into the 4 questions. Do you believe that we should tell people about Jesus? And I think we believe that every group should hear about Jesus. What's interesting to me about this group and this particular presentation today is, we were talking about it. Our passion in this press conference is to evangelize the church. And what I mean by that is not taking away our evangelical beliefs about Jews, Muslims, anybody else, at least hearing the gospel and making their own decision, right? That's what we believe. But one of the things we're trying to do is take this conversation and drive it back into the church. We're not doing it in a corner. That's why we're at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., having the conversation openly, because we think that there are opinion makers, there are media people, there are others who will want to watch that conversation, and we think it's an important conversation. But a lot of this is trying to drive this question back into the church about what we believe, and are we drawing it from biblical, are we doing it based on our personal political views about Israel or the Palestinians, or are we doing it based on the Scriptures? So does that answer your question, or am I think so. Okay, feel free to follow up.
And if I may chime in, it's important to remember, and this is one of the things that New Testament studies has certainly focused on in the last half century. Jesus himself was Jewish. He was presenting how the relationship with God works from within a Jewish perspective and a Jewish mindset. And so I think it's important in talking about that to think about that dimension of this conversation. Proselytizing has kind of become a dirty word in our world and in our culture, but it actually is asking the question of every person, no matter what their religious background, no matter what their ethnicity, how should we live before God? And so I think that's a question every person should consider and take seriously. And to the extent that we're able to do that and introduce that and get people to reflect on that, I think we help our, not just our religious discourse, I think we help our social discourse as well.
That's, if I may, just quickly, it's an irresistible question to me. I'm a Messianic Jew. I'm a Jewish person who believes that Yeshua, Jesus, is the Messiah. And so I feel that actually I am not just an evangelical, but I'm an evangelized Jew, I guess, But I am very assertive in my Jewish identity. I didn't take it as far as Joel and move to Israel, but
You're welcome.
but I sent you. Yeah, it's okay. And so all I can say is I think that that people like me who still strongly identify as a Jewish person, we're actually the perfect bridge to the evangelical church when it comes to Israel. Because we're the ones who, when I approach my brothers and sisters in the Messiah on behalf of my brothers and sisters who are Jewish, it's a very natural bridge to be able to engage my community that I love with my other community that I love, so that together the relationships are strong. I was raised to believe that when you become a believer in Jesus as a Jewish person, you're on the outs, sort of with everybody, But what I've discovered is that it's actually a great position to be in, to build what I think is one of the most important relationships of our modern day, and that's between the real Bible-believing church, the evangelicals of Jesus the Messiah, with Israel and with the Jewish community. So I believe that we need to evangelize a lot more Jewish people so that that bridge actually gets stronger.
I think it's important to note that the three of us, Mitch, Joel, and myself, all have Jewish heritage in our background.
Yes, ma'am.
Penny Starr with Breitbart. I was thinking that this is about the millennials, including my own sons, and a lot that I work with and know. I think that 1948 was a long time ago, and they don't know about that. I think that's really the issue, that if you talk to them and say, what do you know about 1948 and the Balfour Agreement, they're clueless. Do you think, how is that going to change through this program?
Well, our hope will be to produce materials and not just books, but videos and that kind of thing, because most millennials don't read, they watch. And so our hope is to produce materials that will acquaint them with that background and history. I actually think, I agree with you entirely. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the numbers that we see, is that if you look at the lifetime of most millennials and what experiences have driven the Middle East, it's been, the crisis with regard living in an ISIS and post-ISIS world. It's all the stuff that has revolved around countries other than Israel, and most of them, for my generation, I didn't live through the Holocaust, but the shadow of the Holocaust was certainly strong when I was growing up. That shadow is diminishing as well. And so there are lots of factors that are a natural part of my life as a boomer that are certainly not a part of a millennial's life. And so there's just a lot of catching up that needs to be done. And that's part of the rationale for what we're going to do and the kinds of things that we're going to be producing.
Yeah, I would add to that. I'm raising 4 millennials, and that's challenging at every level. It has nothing to do with Israel, but Israel's a part of it. But one of the things I think is interesting is, again, it's for Daryl being born not during the Holocaust, but that's the dominant topic as Israel comes to play. I'm born in April 1967, but I missed all the evangelical euphoria about 67 because I was 2 months old. So I came of age. My first trip to Israel was to study at Tel Aviv University. I got there in August of 1987. I had a few months to enjoy it, and then the first Palestinian Intifada erupted. So Gen Xers were much more influenced by years of Israel is now not David, Israel's now Goliath. That's the media perception. And it flipped the whole story for about a decade of who's right and who's wrong in this story. What is going on here, and what should be done, and what should be the church's response. once you get to 9/11 and going forward, now the issue of radical Islam, suicide bombers, suicide airplane kamikaze attacks, et cetera, et cetera. Now the whole topic is Israel's under attack, as is America. Now suddenly we're allies again, and we've got other issues. So all these things affect. If you were an archaeologist, or you're taking slices of the tell, right? And you're trying to understand what's affecting that group and this group and this group, and there are multiple things. But I think one of the things the biggest thing to me is you go back to where they're getting their information from. Most would say they're getting their information from the Bible, and they would downplay their pastor or Christian leaders. But the question is, where are they getting their information about the Bible? I don't think it's just I think you actually have to take that a little bit more nuanced understanding. And so as we begin to talk to pastors, lay leaders, Bible college presidents, seminary professors, so forth, who's teaching the Bible and how they're teaching it will be an important element of the next generation. And as Bishop Jackson put it well, as we get older, and some older than others, our desire to pass that along effectively is about Bible discipleship. And that, of course, is the Great Commission, not just to lead people to Jesus, but to make disciples, teaching them all the things that Jesus commanded, including God's love for Israel and loving our neighbors.
As we were talking, I was adding up the number of millennials that our 24, 25 people on the Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem have influence over. It's in the tens of thousands. And so our goal one of our main goals, one of them is pretty much an older millennial, and has thousands of millennials in his church. And so I think that we're going to that's one of our main goals. And the survey indicates that the millennials are not galvanized against Israel, but rather undecided. And that's a huge difference. That's an educational opportunity.
And I think it's fair to say, and I want to underscore it because you asked the question, I went in anecdotally thinking the millennials were turning against. I think that we
not true.
Thought that, but it is not. I mean, this is a very detailed study with very low margin of error. That is not the case. It could be eventually, but it's not yet, and that tells us something positive. But we got a lot of work ahead of us with millennials.
And many of us lack of awareness rather than antagonism, based on the survey.
Yes,
That's right.
Yeah.
Undecided, unsure.
They're hearing an array of voices from an array of angles. They're seeing an array of images. Remember, they watch. They don't read. So, and they're seeing this combination, and they're just asking, kind of, where do we land? So I think the high number of uncertainty is and in fact, our numbers actually show these tensions between their allegiance to Israel, but their uncertainty about what exactly that all means. And so that tension is a part of what we're trying to step into and address. Most of us are teaching millennials. I find myself, when I travel nationally and speak, largely to older groups, boomers like me, I end up spending a lot of time talking about millennials as if they're this object out there, that we need to examine. And in fact, what I find is a tremendous sensitivity and curiosity among millennials, but they also see the tensions of the region, and they're wrestling with how to deal with those. Our hope is that our alliance will help them sort some of that out in a way that is beneficial and helpful.
So you need a Twitter account, right?
Yeah.
Social media will be important, but also getting
That we have.
millennials to come to Israel. When you drill down on these numbers, and I would encourage you to do it, what you'll find is anyone who's been to Israel, the numbers are like 95% or something, 90% who have this deep understanding and love for Israel. I mean, it just pops because now you've seen it. And I think that the problem is that only 3% of American evangelicals have been there. And so as the church begins to think, okay, as we take people, shouldn't we be really finding ways to encourage and enable millennials to come?
All you have to do is go to the Golan Heights and realize how close everybody is to everybody.
Well, speaking of millennials, we have a millennial with a microphone with our next question, so that's a good transition.
Hi, Evan Wilt with World Magazine. Thank you all for doing this. My question, you guys were talking about this a little bit, but I really want to drill in on what is at stake here. If millennials don't inherit that love for Israel going forward, and there's not a galvanized belief that you need to support Israel. What really is at stake? What could happen? What are the damages that could take place?
Well, I think there are a couple of areas where that could have implications. If millennials and their children, who are already in college, if there's a negative view of Israel, it usually spills over into a negative view of the Jewish people, unfortunately. And because of that, there can be a distancing of evangelicals to Jewish people, even right here at home. That could lead to a lack of interest in telling Jewish people about the Messiah. That could lead to a lot of bad things. And so I think that that there is the obvious political clout that evangelicals have when it comes to influencing U.S. policy on Israel in many different areas. We would hate to lose that, but I think that would only be one loss, the political influence. I think also there's a social cost to having a bad impression of Israel, because it leads to a negative impression of the Jewish people. And you see this in Europe. Yes. I'm there all the time. You see it in England, you see it in France, and I'd hate to see the United States go in that direction, where not only is there anti-Israelism on the rise, but anti-Semitism on the rise. That's something that needs to be prevented here.
Before we go to our next question, I want to overlook Pastor Suarez.
Well, just in that, I'm 37, so I'm in between. I don't know what I am. I think I'm Generation X, but sometimes, depending on the crowd, maybe sometimes millennial. And I say this with all due respect, and so Scott, don't listen to this part. As long as we continue to treat millennials as a case study, we're going to continue to lose the battle. You have to bring them to the table, and if they continue to feel that they're a special interest group, if you will, of the church, that you approach them the same way you have Sunday school and you have retiree ministry and this and that, whatever, as long as you treat them that way, you're not going to reach them. They have to be brought to the table, and this has been an ongoing problem within the church. The baby boomer generation never wanted to hand the baton to Generation X. They just did not successfully want to turn over the keys to the car. They didn't trust the next generation. And now Generation X and the baby boomer generation is having a hard time trusting the millennial church. Yet remember that the Bible says that this is the generation that's going to see the greatest revival of the church. God trusts in this generation, but the previous generation doesn't always trust in this generation. So I think millennials have to be included. They need to be at the table. They need to, if you're still treating them as an extra group of the church, you are losing the battle. They have to be at the table, and their voice has to be heard on the issue. And then I think you have been given permission to also speak your opinion, your conviction, and influence them to whatever the cause might be.
Great point, Tony. And I just add one thought in implications to your question. And that is, I would say prophetically, when I look at the scriptures, I believe that the world will turn completely against Israel at one point. The Bible speaks of all the nations will come against Jerusalem. So thank God we're not there. Amen. But if American evangelicals are the backbone of love for Israel and the Jewish people. If American evangelicals turn, there's not a lot of other sectors that love Israel based on a deep-rooted principle. They may have other reasons, but those winds will start to change if the church loses its prophetic voice. And so and then rising anti-Semitism will become a huge issue, turning away from standing with Israel. And I do believe in the Abrahamic covenant. Those who bless Israel will be blessed. It doesn't mean you have to agree with every point of what Israel is doing at any given time from a political policy perspective. But if you turn away, the national implications are really quite devastating.
And Tony, just to emphasize the point that you're making, I have terrific respect for the millennials that I teach. They have a sensitivity and awareness to what's going on in the world that really I think our generation to some degree doesn't possess. And so the idea, for me, the idea of handing on the baton is an exciting idea, because I think that the potential of what exists in what millennials offer to the church is so positive in terms of the way they wrestle with questions that we've tended to shunt to the side.
One last question, unless there are others. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Jim Supp, and I am a pastor at Reston Bible Church. It's my privilege to be here today. Dr. Bach, I wanted to ask you a question specifically. When you were talking about millennials, you were specifically referring to a lot of the information. We've talked a lot about what they don't have regard informationally. My question really rests more foundationally in the shift in ideology that is occurring in culture that's influencing young millennials. You know, Bishop Jackson talked about started to approach the difference between biblical justice and social justice. And some of the issues of social justice that are kind of coming out of culture are not just affecting information, but the way they're seeing the world. And I didn't know if you could comment on that specifically.
This is a press conference unto itself, but let me just try and say it this way. I think that part of what we're wrestling with is the different way in which young people process the information they get access to. I'm going to try and explain this. I'm going to try and be brief. Our generation grew up with logic and outlines, okay? Written materials, sequencing, those kinds of things. The younger generation grew up with web pages, okay, and social media. It's associative. It's not the same structure. They don't process in the same kind of way as a result. We tended to think through, how do you align an argument that works down a kind of organized track, if I can say it that way. The millennials have lived in a world in which an array of voices are coming at them simultaneously, okay? And then they have to decide how they deal with that. We really have two models for how people deal with that. On the one hand, they drop into their track and they go like this, okay? And they just go through life. I'm committed to this track and this is all that I'm going to be about, and it produces a kind of tribalism that has trouble with the very kinds of conversations we're talking about having. But the second thing that happens with the other group is they're trying to process all these voices, which are in tension and conflict with one another, and make landing places a hard thing to find. So my answer to you is that I think that because of the different social experience in processing information that the younger generation has generally been exposed to from birth, and it's only going to get more intense, has changed the way they process information. And I find myself having to go through a translation exercise, given the background that I have, in order to communicate with the younger generation, because I actually think that some of what they get is beneficial if they'll work with it all, okay? And that part of the responsibility of educators in dealing with this is to help people work with all this array of information coming at them at different angles, because no one has it 100% right and no one has it 100% wrong. And so working through those difficulties and nuances is an important part of the discussion. So that actually is a, how can I say it? That's a complicated answer to what is actually a very complicated question.
Can I add one thought, and that is, 1 Corinthians 13 says that we know in part. And when we see in Proverbs the multitude of counselors gives us wisdom, gives us safety. I think millennials are sending us a message about how we're not doing well in teaching them, but they're also sending us a message about this issue of biblical justice. And it concerns me deeply. I mentioned it, but I'll use this moment to underscore. It concerns me deeply that the evangelical pro-Israel movement is so often heard as either or. This is a problem because it's just not biblical. And it drives wedges where there already are wedges, and the church is not supposed to be driving wedges. And Jesus didn't drive the wedge. So if you're going to abandon the love your neighbor, love your enemy message, then you really are abandoning central principles of the New Testament, Jesus message. For me, a big, so just to give you an example, just in November alone, by God's grace, and but also by a desire and a prayer, Lord, how do I love, as an Israeli now, an Israeli evangelical? That's an interesting discussion. As an Israeli evangelical, how do I love my neighbors? So just in November, the Lord opened the door for me to take a group of American evangelical leaders, mostly pro-Israel Christian Zionists, and go to Egypt and go to Jordan. We met with Islamic leaders. Larry was on this trip. We met with President El-Sisi for 3 hours. We met with the top leadership of the Egyptian Protestant evangelical community. for hours, just listening to them. What are you seeing? What's going on? From your perspective. We're not here to tell you things. We want to learn. How can we love you and serve you and pray for you and stand with you? Went to Jordan. Yes, we met with top government officials. We had a working lunch with with King Abdullah. Fascinating for American evangelicals who love Israel to spend time with Arab Muslim leaders, but also with 36 Jordanian Christian leaders. And for me, then I went on to spend time with about 150 Palestinian evangelical leaders and their wives for a retreat, and then to about 300 Israeli, Jewish, and Arab believer pastors and leaders. I'm just saying that it was rare for me, and rare I think for many people, to get a chance in a 2.5-week period to spend time with the leaders of the evangelical movements in Egypt, Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, and Israel. And it just reminded me, we're not all going to get those opportunities, but that heart is something that the millennials are saying, it doesn't sound right in our ears. It doesn't feel right in our heart when you say this and you don't talk about that. When you talk about your love for this side, it just doesn't, they don't know how to articulate that. But the data tells us they believe evangelicals who love Israel need to show more love for the Palestinians and the Arab side. But it also is telling the flip side. There are some, and the replacement theologians tend to have a greater love for Palestinians and Arabs. They've got to develop a compassion. You don't have to agree on everything. My Egyptian evangelical friends and Jordanians, they do not agree with me on many of these issues. But how do we work in John 13 love and John 17 unity to love and respect and listen to one another and encourage and serve one another? I think the millennials are on to something that we should be listening to.
We've got one final question, and when we break up, if there are any other conversations you want to have, our participants, panelists are available to anyone who wants to stay longer. Go ahead.
Larry, I wanted to clarify what I meant. There is 100 million people that attend churches. 100,000, I haven't awakened yet, but 100 million American church attendees that go to church that do not understand the biblical significance of the state of Israel. And for the frontline work that we do, the Vatican has already acknowledged Palestine. A lot of their bishops have called for Israel to leave the occupied land. The World Council of Churches has sponsored, major events, the Christ at the Checkpoint, the Sabille Foundation, and other churches. So this is part of the challenge, Joel, is to reach out to some of these folks. A National Council of Churches has been lobbying the White House for a long time, calling on Israel to leave that occupied land. So that gets back to some of the prophetic air where you don't understand that 20% of the Bible is prophetic. And this is part of the challenge that we have from our side. You get Jewish believers and Palestinian believers together. One of the bone of contention that seems to come up is who's right to this land. So,
Bill, I wish your 100,000 was right. I had a feeling it was a little low. But I will say this, that there are a lot of critical concerns, and you're all arguing for why the Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem should exist, for what we would think would be a biblically based, sensitive approach to motivating evangelicals to love Israel and her neighbors, and to put the discussion of replacement theology and supersessionism on the table, because people like to avoid the theological issues and claim that they're ivory tower issues. They're not ivory tower, because if someone believes in supersessionism, that God's covenant with Israel ceases to exist, then I just lost who I am as a Jew. And so that's rather important to me, as it is to a Palestinian believer, their identity. And so these things need to be respectfully talked over. And so one of the things we're also going to do as the Alliance is we're producing a significant statement that will be released at the National Religious Broadcasters meeting at the end of February. And so watch for that one, because that's going to be extremely important, and it will set our agenda for what we think will be at least a decade to come as we work on these issues. even the millennials are going to get older, and so we want to take our time to address these things properly. So next phase 2 will be at the NRB in February.
Just remember that what takes place in the ivory tower, when it's taught to generation after generation, ends up in the streets. And so it's not as isolated as people think.
And I would add one thought is if we really want to deal in a loving way, a non-defensive, non-judgmental way with replacement theology, supersessionism, before we take the speck out of our brother's eye or try, we've got to take the plank out of our own, which means the immediate attack line is you don't love Arabs, you don't love Muslims, you don't even care about the Christian neighbors, you don't deal with justice issues and injustice issues. So before you start telling us about how righteous Israel is and how God has this divine plan, and that's a fair argument. In my view, it's a fair argument that our side has not done well with this. We can't fix every problem, but we can start working on the planks in our own eyes and say, how do we do better? It doesn't mean we'll necessarily convince our brothers and sisters, but we can't have that issue of silence or blindness to injustice be tagged to us. And I would just note A.W. Tozer has a great point. He says, a scared world needs a fearless church. And these are issues of terror in the Middle East and great division. We need a fearless church that is biblical and is loving and is following right after our Prince of Peace. And I don't think there's any other way to do it.
And regarding the education piece, Bill, we're honored to have with us Dr. Jerry Johnson, who's the president of the National Louis Broadcasters, that Dr. Glazer mentioned. And I know that one of the themes of the upcoming conference is honoring Israel on their 70th year. So thank you for that. I know many of your members are about educating the biblical role and prophetic role of Israel. So thank you for that. We do have one more question from Josh, and then let's say I want to be sensitive to people's time, so let's make this our last question before we break up.
Thanks. Just because it's so timely, reports indicate that the Trump administration will soon announce the embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. What would you expect would be the short-term implications of that in Israel?
There's no time to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem than this week. And I think it's a great question because the Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem, could it be more timely? These are geopolitical questions, and some of them you'll see reflected in the data as you spend more time on it. You'll see there's a lack of clarity, even confliction among evangelicals about how to. If I believe that Israel has a divine right to be there by God's grace, not because we deserve it, but because God just said He was going to happen, then what's our responsibility? To share the land, to love our neighbors? You'll see that in the data, and I think no time like the present to be encouraging the church to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem.
We wish we asked that question in the survey if we would have known what day the press conference was and the day when this would be announced. So that would have been, Joel was able to predict a number of things, but we didn't make it on this
one. We
one.
aren't that good.
But if you study through the survey, you'll see that there are indications about what evangelicals believe about this. They are all for security for Israel. They're all for the land being in Jewish hands, and they're all for Israel sharing the land.
And they want peace. The questions of when and how, those are big questions, and they've confounded the foreign ministers and the presidents and the kings and prime ministers. So it's not surprising that the church doesn't have exact, how do I take that biblical principle and apply it in a conflict that's 4,000 years old. So, but this is exactly why the alliance exists.
Yeah, well, our hope is that we'll help people to think through the layers of what a question like that actually involves and to wrestle with how those layers actually play out.